I went to the doctor's office for a routine diabetes checkup that lasted 3 hours. But when I came home, my son had changed every lock on my house and was refusing to let me inside my own property. But here I am, 69 years old, standing in my Texas driveway with my house keys back in my hand and arrest warrants in my briefcase because apparently Greg forgot that the deed to this house is still in my name, and what he did wasn't inheritance planning. It was breaking and entering. The irony isn't lost on me that my son, who'd been living in my guest room rent-free for 8 months, thought 3 hours was enough time to stage a hostile takeover of a house he didn't legally own. This morning started like any other Tuesday. I had my quarterly appointment with Dr. Patterson to check my blood sugar levels and discuss my diabetes management. A routine I'd maintained for 15 years since Dorothy passed, and I had to start taking better care of myself. Greg was still asleep when I left at 8:30, which wasn't unusual since he'd been staying up late job hunting on his laptop ever since his expensive divorce left him financially devastated. I left him a note saying I'd be back around noon and reminded him to take in the package delivery I was expecting from Amazon. If you've ever trusted someone with access to your home, only to discover they saw that trust as weakness and your temporary absence as opportunity, then settle in close, because this retired bank manager has a story that'll make your blood boil and restore your faith in property law at the same time. What Greg didn't understand is that 40 years of working in banking teaches you more than just financial management. It teaches you about contracts, property rights, and the importance of reading the fine print before you make moves that could land you in legal trouble. When I pulled into my driveway at 12:15, carrying my prescription refills and looking forward to the leftover pot roast Dorothy's recipe had taught me to make, I noticed Greg's car was gone, but there was a locksmith's van parked where he usually left his beat-up Honda. My first thought was that maybe we'd had a break-in and Greg had called someone to secure the house. That optimistic assumption lasted exactly as long as it took me to try my key in the front door and discover it no longer worked. That's when Greg opened the door from the inside, looked me straight in the eye, and said the words that would change our relationship forever. "Dad, this house belongs to me now. You can't live here anymore." No explanation, no discussion, no acknowledgement that this was the house I'd been paying the mortgage on for 32 years, the house where Dorothy and I had raised him, the house where I'd been graciously letting him stay while he got back on his feet after his divorce. If you believe that people who try to steal property from their own parents should face the full consequences of their actions, go ahead and subscribe, because I've got more stories about entitled family members learning hard lessons about ownership law. And if you want to know what happens when someone confuses temporary residence with permanent ownership, well, you're about to discover that property deeds trump wishful thinking every single time. Greg wasn't always a thief, and that's what makes his lockout attempt so shocking and heartbreaking. I remember when that boy was 7 years old, helping me paint the fence around this very house, getting more paint on himself than on the wood, but insisting he was helping Daddy make everything beautiful. Dorothy would bring us lemonade and laugh at our matching paint-splattered clothes, and Greg would beam with pride at being included in the grown-up work of maintaining our family home. "This is our house, isn't it, Daddy?" he'd ask, and I'd ruffle his hair and tell him it was our family's house, and someday when he was all grown up, it would help him build his own family. Through his teenage years, Greg was the kind of son any father would be proud of. He played varsity football, maintained decent grades, and never gave Dorothy and me the kind of trouble some of our friends dealt with from their kids. When he graduated high school, I converted the garage into a workshop where we could work on cars together. And some of my happiest memories are of Saturday mornings spent teaching Greg how to change oil, replace brake pads, and understand the satisfaction of fixing things with your own hands. "You're good at this stuff, Dad," he'd say when we'd successfully complete a repair. I hope I'm as smart as you someday. Even as an adult, Greg seemed to have his head on straight. He went to community college, got his certification in computer repair, and built a modest but steady business, fixing laptops and setting up networks for small companies around town. When he married Jennifer 8 years ago, Dorothy and I were thrilled to see him settle down with a woman who seemed to appreciate his work ethic and gentle nature. They bought a small house across town, and for several years, everything seemed perfect. Greg would bring Jennifer over for Sunday dinners, help me with yard work, and call regularly just to check on us after Dorothy got sick. The trouble started when Jennifer decided she wanted a bigger house, a newer car, and a lifestyle that Greg's computer repair income couldn't support. Instead of adjusting her expectations or finding ways to increase their household income, she began pressuring Greg to take on debt they couldn't afford and making him feel inadequate for not being able to provide the luxuries she saw her friends enjoying. When the marriage finally collapsed last year, Greg lost not just his wife, but half of everything they'd accumulated, plus alimony payments that left him barely able to afford basic living expenses. That's when I made what I thought was a generous offer. Come stay in the guest room while you get back on your feet. No rent, no time limit, just family helping family through a difficult transition. For 8 months, I watched Greg rebuild his confidence and his business while living under my roof. I thought I was helping my son recover from a devastating setback. I had no idea I was housing someone who would eventually see my temporary absence as an opportunity to steal my home. The first sign that Greg's thinking had taken a dangerous turn came about 3 weeks ago during what I thought was a casual conversation about estate planning. I'd mentioned that I was updating my will to make sure everything was organized properly for when my time comes, and Greg's reaction was immediate and intense. "Dad," he said, "why wait until you're dead? Why not just transfer the house to me now so we can avoid probate and inheritance taxes?" The way he said it, like this was an obvious financial strategy rather than a major life decision, should have been a red flag. When I explained that I wasn't ready to give up ownership of my home while I was still perfectly capable of managing my own affairs, Greg's demeanor changed. He started bringing up concerns about my age, my diabetes, my ability to maintain such a large property on my own. "What if something happens to you?" he'd ask. "What if you have a medical emergency and can't make decisions? Wouldn't it be better to have everything settled legally beforehand?" Every conversation began to revolve around hypothetical scenarios where I was incapacitated and Greg was the responsible son stepping in to manage my affairs. The pressure became more persistent after that. Greg would leave articles on my kitchen table about elderly people being taken advantage of by scammers, about the importance of having family members with legal authority to handle emergencies, about the benefits of transferring property before death. He'd mention stories he'd heard about probate court complications and suggest that transferring the deed to him would be protecting the family's interests. Nardi. When I continued to resist, he started acting like my reluctance was unreasonable, even selfish. Last week, the tone shifted from persuasion to something that felt more like coercion. "Dad, you're not getting any younger," Greg said during what I thought would be a pleasant dinner conversation. "At your age, with your health issues, anything could happen. If you really cared about family, you'd make sure I was legally protected if something happened to you." The implication was clear. If I didn't voluntarily transfer ownership, I was being a bad father who didn't care about his son's future security. When I firmly told Greg that I appreciated his concern but wouldn't be pressured into making decisions about my property, he got quiet and sullen for several days. He stopped joining me for meals, avoided conversation, and spent most of his time on phone calls in his room with the door closed. I thought maybe he was finally focusing on rebuilding his own life and looking for his own place. What I didn't realize was that he was researching property law, locksmith services, and planning what he apparently thought would be a legal way to force my hand. The morning of my doctor's appointment, Greg was unusually cheerful and helpful, offering to drive me to the clinic and suggesting I take my time with Dr. Patterson to discuss all my health concerns thoroughly. I thought my son was finally showing mature concern for my well-being. I had no idea he was calculating how much time he'd need to change the locks and stage his takeover of my house. Standing on my own front porch, holding my house key that no longer worked while my son blocked the doorway like some kind of security guard, was one of the most surreal and infuriating moments of my 69 years on this earth. "Greg," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "what exactly do you think you're doing here?" His response was delivered with the kind of cold certainty that suggested he'd been rehearsing this moment for weeks. "Dad, I've been thinking about our conversation regarding your estate planning, and I've decided to take proactive steps to protect both of us. This house is now under my legal control." The audacity of that statement, "under my legal control," would have been laughable if it weren't so infuriating. When I pointed out that the deed to the house was still in my name and he had no legal authority to change my locks or deny me access to my own property, Greg pulled out his phone and showed me what appeared to be legal documents he'd printed from some website. "I researched this, Dad. According to Texas property law, if I've been living here for more than 6 months and you've allowed me to make improvements and contributions to the household, I have what's called adverse possession rights. Plus, given your age and health issues, this could be considered a competency situation." I stared at my son in disbelief as he rattled off legal terms he clearly didn't understand, trying to justify what was essentially a home invasion with half-baked internet research and wishful thinking. "Greg," I said, "adverse possession requires hostile occupation for years, not months, and there's nothing wrong with my competency. You're committing a crime right now, and you need to unlock this door immediately." But Greg had apparently convinced himself that his plan was legally sound and morally justified. "Dad, I'm doing this for your own good. You can't live alone safely anymore, and this house is too much for you to handle." That's when I noticed that not only had Greg changed the locks, but he'd also been busy inside the house. Through the front window, I could see that Dorothy's antique dining room set was missing, along with the china cabinet that had belonged to her grandmother. When I confronted Greg about the missing furniture, his mask of fake concern slipped completely. "I had to liquidate some assets to pay for the legal fees and security improvements," he said. "Don't worry, everything I sold will be deducted from your estate value, so it all works out fairly in the end." The casual way he talked about liquidating assets and estate value like I was already dead, like my possessions were his to dispose of, crystallized something important for me. This wasn't just a son making poor decisions under financial stress. This was theft, pure and simple, dressed up in legal language that Greg didn't understand, and moral justifications that didn't exist. My boy had decided that his immediate financial needs were more important than my property rights, my dignity, or even basic family loyalty. That's when I pulled out my own phone and made 2 calls that would change everything. First to 911, then to Attorney Johnson. If Greg wanted to play legal games with my property, he was about to learn that real legal knowledge beats internet research every single time. For exactly 47 minutes, I stood locked out of my own house while my son refused to acknowledge that what he was doing constituted multiple felonies under Texas law. During those 47 minutes, Greg continued to insist that his research had given him legitimate legal grounds for assuming control of my property, and I continued to explain that he was confusing his wishful thinking with actual property law. The most infuriating part wasn't just being denied access to my own home, it was watching my son double down on his delusion that stealing from his father was somehow a responsible financial planning strategy. Mrs. Rodriguez from next door came outside when she heard our raised voices and offered to call the police, but I told her I'd already done that and was waiting for them to arrive. "Mr. Morehouse," she said, "I saw Greg loading furniture into a rental truck this morning while you were gone. I thought maybe you were moving or doing some redecorating." That confirmed what I'd suspected when I saw the empty dining room through the window. Greg hadn't just locked me out. He'd been systematically looting my house while I was at my doctor's appointment. When I confronted Greg about the furniture theft, his justification was breathtaking in its audacity. "Dad, that old furniture was just taking up space, and I needed some quick cash to cover the costs of securing the property. You should be thanking me for finally decluttering this place." Thanking him for stealing Dorothy's antique furniture that had been in her family for 3 generations. For selling pieces that held decades of memories and had never been his to touch, let alone dispose of. The worst part of those 47 minutes was realizing that Greg genuinely believed he was justified in everything he'd done. He'd convinced himself that my age and diabetes made me incompetent to manage my own affairs, that his financial desperation gave him the right to accelerate his inheritance, and that his internet research had revealed legal loopholes that would protect him from consequences. When I tried to explain that adverse possession required years of hostile occupation and that competency challenges required court orders and medical evaluations, Greg just kept repeating phrases he'd obviously memorized from legal websites without understanding their actual meaning. What became clear during our standoff was that Greg had been planning this for weeks, possibly months. He'd researched locksmith services, investigated property law, arranged for furniture removal, and timed everything to coincide with my doctor's appointment. This wasn't an impulsive decision made in a moment of financial desperation. This was a calculated crime committed by someone who thought his father was too old, too trusting, and too isolated to fight back effectively. But Greg had made one critical error in his planning. He'd assumed that a 69-year-old retired bank manager wouldn't understand property law or have the resources to challenge his takeover attempt. He'd forgotten that 40 years of banking experience includes extensive knowledge of real estate transactions, property rights, and the legal system that protects homeowners from exactly this kind of theft. When Officer Martinez finally pulled into my driveway, Greg was about to get an education in the difference between internet research and actual law enforcement. Officer Martinez took exactly 3 minutes to assess the situation and determined that Greg had committed multiple crimes. After examining my driver's license showing my address, reviewing the property deed I keep in my car's glove compartment, and listening to Greg's confused explanation about adverse possession rights and competency concerns, Officer Martinez looked at my son with the kind of professional patience police reserve for people who've made spectacularly bad decisions. "Sir," he said to Greg, "you cannot legally change the locks on a property you don't own, regardless of how long you've been living there. This constitutes unlawful exclusion and potentially breaking and entering." The look on Greg's face when Officer Martinez explained that his internet research had led him to commit felonies was almost worth the humiliation of being locked out of my own house. "But I've been contributing to the household expenses," Greg protested, "and my father has diabetes and shouldn't be living alone." Officer Martinez's response was swift and educational. "Sir, paying some bills while living as a guest doesn't give you property rights, and medical concerns don't give you the authority to take over someone else's home without court orders. You need to provide Mr. Morehouse with keys to this property immediately, or you'll be arrested for unlawful exclusion." When Greg reluctantly handed over the new keys, Officer Martinez asked about the missing furniture Mrs. Rodriguez had reported seeing loaded into a truck. Greg's explanation that he'd liquidated some assets for property improvement purposes was met with another dose of legal reality. "Sir, selling property that doesn't belong to you is theft, regardless of your family relationship or financial motivations. Do you have receipts for these sales and the item's current location? That's when Greg's confident demeanor finally cracked completely, and he began to understand that his proactive estate planning was actually a series of crimes with serious legal consequences. Attorney Johnson arrived 20 minutes later with documentation that made Greg's situation even worse. "Mr. Morehouse," he explained, "based on your son's admissions and the officer's report, we have grounds for charges of unlawful exclusion, theft, conversion of property, and potentially elder abuse under Texas law. The furniture sales alone constitute felony theft if the combined value exceeds $1,500. When I described the antique dining set and china cabinet that had been in Dorothy's family for generations, Attorney Johnson's expression grew grim. "Those pieces are likely worth significantly more than the felony threshold." The final blow to Greg's delusional plan came when Officer Martinez asked if he'd obtained proper permits for changing the locks on a property he didn't own. In Texas, unauthorized lock changes on occupied properties can be prosecuted as criminal mischief and unlawful entry. You've essentially broken into your father's house and stolen his possessions while he was away. Deal. As Greg was read his rights and placed in the back of the patrol car, I felt a mixture of vindication and sadness watching my son face the consequences of assuming that family relationships trumped property law and that elderly parents could be bulldozed without facing legal repercussions. 3 weeks later, I'm sitting in my living room with my locks, holding my keys, watching the evening news in the recliner Dorothy bought me for my 60th birthday. Surrounded by the few pieces of furniture Greg hadn't managed to sell before his arrest. The dining room looks empty without Dorothy's antique set, and I'm still working with Attorney Johnson to track down the buyers and recover what can be recovered. But the important thing is that I'm home, safe, and legally protected from any future attempts by my son to help me with my property management. Greg is currently out on bail, facing multiple felony charges, and living in a studio apartment he can barely afford while his court-appointed attorney tries to negotiate a plea deal that might keep him out of prison. We haven't spoken since his arrest, though Attorney Johnson tells me Greg's lawyer has suggested that a full confession, restitution for the stolen items, and a formal apology might result in reduced charges. I'm still considering whether mercy is appropriate for someone who showed me none when he thought I was helpless to resist his takeover attempt. The hardest part of this whole situation isn't the theft or the lockout or even the violation of trust. It's the realization that Greg never saw me as a competent adult, deserving of respect and autonomy. In his mind, my age and medical condition made me a problem to be managed rather than a father to be honored, and my property was something he could claim whenever his financial situation became desperate enough. He'd convinced himself that stealing from me was actually helping me, that violating my rights was protecting my interests, and that his needs justified any violation of my dignity. What Greg never understood is that competency isn't determined by age or medical conditions. It's demonstrated by the ability to make informed decisions and handle one's affairs responsibly. A man who maintains his property, manages his finances, keeps his medical appointments, and understands his legal rights isn't someone who needs a hostile takeover by a son who can't manage his own life successfully. The irony is that while Greg was plotting to take control of my house because he thought I was incompetent, he was demonstrating through his actions that he was the one who couldn't handle responsibility maturely. I've spent the past 3 weeks updating my will, establishing clearer legal protections for my property, and making sure that anyone who thinks my eventual incapacity will be an opportunity for financial gain understands exactly what legal consequences await them. Dorothy always said that the best way to show love for family is to hold them accountable for their choices, and I think she'd approve of the lesson Greg is learning about respecting other people's property and legal rights. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been targeted by someone who confused your kindness with weakness or your age with vulnerability, leave me a comment below. Your experience matters, and sharing it might help someone else recognize the warning signs before they become a victim. Subscribe if you believe that family relationships don't override property law, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is make sure people face the full legal consequences of their criminal behavior.